A massive thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this video.
Welcome back everybody to another MOTOBOB video where you join me today on the UK launch of the Scram 411, a brand new little bike from Royal Enfield. Now this is essentially a more urban focused adaptation of their hugely popular Himalayan adventure bike. And so that begs the question, is this now the one to go for, especially if you're predominantly riding on the road, or is the original still the best? Well, in this video, we'll find out. Now the engine might seem like a bit of an odd place to start because it's the exact same unit in both bikes. You've got a 411cc air-cooled single cylinder and it makes about 24 horsepower peak and 32 Nm of peak torque. Not massive figures, and I think that's where the sort of adventure bike image of the Himalayan starts to reveal its shortcomings. When you think of adventure bikes, you sort of think of road trips and maybe weekends away, and that's always going to involve a little bit of A-road or motorway work. And for me, especially if you added luggage and a passenger or both, 24 horses just isn't enough for overtaking and stuff at 60 or 70 miles per hour. The other thing is you often find yourself like banging down a gear to get the revs up to try and get the most out of it if you do have to overtake. And that's where singles start to feel a little bit vibey and unrefined. But this bike, the Scram 411, is more so targeted at an urban audience. In the presentation, Royal Enfield were talking about, commuters in places like India, where perhaps the road surfaces aren't great, so you still want tall travel suspension, you still want semi-off-road tyres, but equally they were talking about customers in Europe that might live in the city and commute in the week, but then at the weekend they might go just out of town and explore some green lanes and that sort of thing. Now at 20, 30, even 40 miles per hour, it feels much smoother because you're way lower in the revs, and also 32 Nm of peak torque is still enough on a little bike like this to beat the majority of the traffic off the line when you're getting away from the lights. So yeah, I think it's a question of context. If you consider this bike to be predominantly a town commuter, then the engine feels much more fit for purpose. Now there are significant changes to the chassis, or rather the front wheel. The Himalayan gets a 21-incher with a relatively skinny front tyre there, and that gives it a little bit more off-road capability, so it'll roll better over obstacles and rougher terrain. But the trade-off is handling. It feels much like any other bike with a skinny 21-inch front, a little bit disconnected, a little bit vague. When you turn the bars, you don't feel like the exact same action is occurring at the front wheel. This bike, because it's more street biased, they fitted it with a 19-inch front wheel, and also the tyre is a little wider, so it's 100mm to 90mm on the Himalayan. Today, I felt like the result is really good. It feels much crisper at the front end, and then as a secondary benefit, because this wheel is smaller, and I think there's 10mm less travel in the fork as well, it cants the whole bike forward. The rear wheel's the same size, the shock is the same length, and so without changing the frame is exactly the same as the Himalayan. It alters the geometry a little bit, just enough to quicken up the steering. It feels more agile, which is exactly what you want when you're riding in town and picking your way through traffic. You will sacrifice a little bit of off-road capability. I think you could still do some easy gravel laning with no problems on this bike though. You still get 190mm of travel at the front, 180mm on the shock. But realistically, I think most of these bikes are going to spend most of their miles on the road, and this one handles much better. Another result of that slight drop at the front end is that you do get a lower seat height, although it is marginal. It's 5mm lower than the Himalayan, but still, if you're short in the leg and you like to flat foot your bikes, then this is probably the one to go for. But more significant than that is that they've updated the saddle with a more comfortable design. In the presentation, they showed some pressure mapping that they'd done to understand where they needed to make the seat more comfortable. And for me, that was one of the big drawbacks of the Himalayan. I found it too thin in the padding, a little too narrow as well, and so when you were tilting the bike beneath you, I felt like you were sitting on the subframe at the edges and found it quite uncomfortable. This is a big improvement though. It feels like there's much more padding at the back here. It's still pretty narrow, but overall today we've done, quite a few hours riding and no discomfort at all, whereas with the Himalayan, after 10 minutes, I was like, I'm not going to get on that well with this. So again, another big tick for this bike. I suppose there are a couple of drawbacks you ought to be aware of though. One is that they've removed the windscreen or fly screen just to give it a more naked bike look, I guess. But yeah, if you are doing motorway riding and if you are going further afield, then you're going to get a bit more wind protection on your torso. It'll keep the chill off a little bit. It's not a huge screen on the Himalayan, but certainly it'd be the better choice for distance riding. And then also they've removed the rear rack. They've just put a passenger grab rail on, and also the racks that are on either side of the tank. So you could fit a tail pack there. You could fit some crash bar bags at the front. And so in terms of carrying luggage and flexibility and doing light touring and that sort of thing, the Himalayan still wins. But for me, this seat is so much more comfortable and addresses one of the major issues I have with the Himalayan, and so this would be the one I'd choose. Now, there are a couple of areas where there isn't a great deal of differentiation between the two models. One would be the tech. They're both very, very simple. No fancy rider aids or modes to speak of, just ABS because it's mandatory. And then you've got a simple analog speedo with a digital LCD display in the middle that gives you all the basic riding information. The standout feature for these bikes has to be the Tripper navigation pod. I think it's standard in some countries and maybe you buy it as an accessory in others, but it's really nice and easy to use. I had the Meteor 350 with it last year, played with it plenty, and I found it to be really well thought out. You just use the Royal Enfield app to plan a route, and then you stick it in your pocket and the Tripper pod shows you turn-by-turn directions. Very similar to the Beeline Moto device, in fact. To be transparent, they're a channel sponsor, but if you like the look of this and you don't own an Enfield, then check out the links in the description. It's basically the same thing, but I found the Enfield Tripper to be equally well designed, and it's a great feature on a bike at this price point. Now, the other dimension in which I'd say it's a tough call between the two would be the styling. I mean, clearly they've given this more of a youthful urban look. They've done away with the windscreen, like I say. They've got rid of the racks. It's got a lower front mudguard, a neat little headlight nacelle, and then also these more pop-in paint jobs. They're certainly a bit more lively. But personally, I quite like some of the muted, more adventure bike designs on the Himalayan. And I think in terms of looks, that bike might just edge this one, but it's totally personal opinion, so let me know your pick down in the comments. Now that brings me swiftly onto the price, and this bike starts at $4,599 for the most basic paint options, and that's just 100 quid less than the Himalayan. Now on the one hand, you might think that 100 quid doesn't sound bad for a windscreen and the racks and the extra capability that that gives you, but I think I'd argue that if you're mainly riding on the road, then the improvement in handling from that smaller front wheel and the extra comfort that you get with that saddle, I mean, what would you pay to have a saddle redone with like gel inserts? Easily that much. You know, for me, it makes it an absolute no-brainer. Sure, there's a little bit less hardware, but actually for 100 quid less, you're getting a better road bike. As always though, I'd love to know which one you'd pick down in the comments below, and I'll leave you today with a word from our sponsor.
A massive thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. It's a super easy place to make a website with absolutely loads of beautiful looking templates to choose from. But beneath the surface, there's much more to it. You can grow a whole community with their powerful features for creating gated members-only content, as well as email communications and useful audience insight. You can also start a blog with full threaded comments for your audience. You can automatically cross-post from your social media profiles, and there are loads of third-party extensions to help with starting an online store, like inventory management, global shipping, and more. So simply head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and then when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/MOTOBOB and you'll save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. So once again, a massive thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this video.